We have plenty of time for Q&A. You can call on the hands as you see them.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, my name's Nicole Carreri. I'm a graduate student from Hartford Seminary and hope to be a PhD student next fall somewhere. I am very fascinated with this story and his real passionate commitment to journalism and to really going after the story as he felt, he had to with integrity. What kinds of thoughts did he have, towards the end of his life about what he'd seen globally, about different cultures, about ideas of the changing global dynamics? Did he ever comment on that kind of in a more broad way towards the end of his life? He's had so much experience. How did he reflect on his interaction with all those cultures and politics?
Mm-hmm. He was appreciative of cultures around the globe. On his international tours, he would typically go to a dozen nations or more. As I said, he would talk with leaders as well as people on the street. He was very saddened that what he saw among American news organizations as well as the American people as being overly isolationist and not really understanding what was taking place elsewhere in the world. And there's been a lot of criticism of news organizations, dating back to 9/11. People were mentioning, why did this happen in this country? Why do these people dislike us so much? And they would have known the answers to that if our news organizations here have been doing a better job of international reporting. And talking about cultural imperialism, which is seen, of course, very negatively around the globe. So he was, definitely an internationalist, and dating back to the years just before World War II. And I'm not giving you more than you're asking for here. No. America was very isolationist at that time as well, and that's certainly one of the things that the Murrow team attempted to do, and their reporting from Europe attempted to do that as well. America did not want to be involved in that European war. They thought it, was somebody else's war, and eventually, of course, it was brought home, and we had to be involved in it. So, but the isolationism has not ceased to exist in more recent years, and he was very excited about his job as the bureau chief in Japan in the late 50s and early 1960s. But that, was one of his criticisms once he came back to the United States. Most of the U.S. networks, in the interest of cost savings, have closed the majority of their bureaus that existed at that time. So that, we largely only hear about what's taking place elsewhere in the world. When America is involved elsewhere in the world.
And I noticed that in the evening news last night.
Yeah.
I've got the network news on, and then I switched to the PBS. PBS has international scope. I'm hearing about,
Yes.
issues happening in Australia, issues happening in the UK,
Mm-hmm.
as well as Olympics coverage. But, NBC was very narrow in their focus
Mm-hmm.
last night.
Yeah, certainly PBS, BBC, Al Jazeera, are exceptions to that. But yeah, the national media, not so much.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a question?
More comment, and I do have to do that to get back to it. I can see sort of the connection sort of filtering down to Jonathan. That
Oh, yeah,
sort of,
Who's that against her?
don't you think?
If responding to critics could translate to arguing on Facebook, yeah, maybe it is.
No, but sort of the idea that you're with the center, and your interest in the Muslim world.
Yeah, I mean,
Speak
it's
out.
I don't know how this stuff seems is genetic or not, but I don't think I'd be a very good journalist. My wife's a journalist, so she's really good at asking tough questions. I tend to be averse to confrontation, but I mean, in the sense of
the standing against perhaps like tyranny of majority opinion. That's certainly one of our missions, just because it happens that majority opinion on issues of Muslim world West relations tends to be pretty bad and inaccurate. So it's important.
Yes, sir.
Did Cecil do a book of his own describing all of his accomplishments, or what he thought would be best way to accomplish things in our world, other than have one battle after another in World War II, involving almost everybody in the world in a huge struggle, which may have occurred anyway, but did he see any way around this, or did he do a book on it? I wondered if he did.
No, that's an interesting thing about him. Jonathan and I were talking about this, that after Suez to Singapore, which basically ends with his foreign correspondence years, so that would be the beginning of World War II, he never writes another book, and certainly never an autobiography, which would have been a wonderful contribution. He started to write a book based on his interviews about the lack of knowledge concerning fascism in America. And he actually had a contract with Random House to do that. But his wife read the script and decided that it was so negative that if it were published, he would never get another book published. And he basically just put the manuscript in the drawer. And I've not been able to find it, so apparently it was destroyed or lost somewhere along the way. But it would have been wonderful if he had written his autobiography, but he did not.
So you had to write it for him.
Yes, that is true. Yeah.
Yes.
Do you think him being the son of immigrants, I guess was it his parents were immigrants, or his parents,
Mm-hmm.
sort of informed his decision to be a journalist, and his brother's decision to also go into media?
I think so. Yeah, I think he saw that as a way to expose wrongdoing, not only internationally but in America as well, and to recommend action. American journalism has basically moved away from what Murrow actually believed, and he taught his people what he called advocacy journalism, where he really talked about identifying issues but also recommending ways to solve those issues. And we don't typically get that sort of journalism these days. And of course, if you look at the history, good night and good luck. But most of the people who worked with Murrow, their careers ended up being very bittersweet. A lot of them got out of journalism into other professions. A number of them were fired from their jobs. Murrow himself, of course, basically by mutual agreement left CBS and came to Washington and headed the USIA under Kennedy before he died of cancer. So Cecil, of all the people who were part of the Murrow team, probably had one of the longest careers in journalism of any of the people who worked with Murrow. And that's one of the interesting facets of this most esteemed team in the history of American journalism. Most of them became very disenchanted with journalism, and as I say, eventually left or were forced to leave the profession. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk, about it. It's very interesting. How much did his experience of reporting in the war, particularly when he was reporting in East Asia before the Japanese invasion, affect his later reporting long after the war finished and during the Cold War?
Trying to sort through those years a bit. Without a doubt, he was greatly affected by British unpreparedness in Singapore. Those of you who know the history of that period, is one of the great disasters of World War II. Churchill, when he heard about the sinking of the Repulse and the Prince of Wales, he was awakened at night to be delivered that news, and supposedly his aide said he just put his head in his hands and almost wept because he recognized that he probably could have done more as the prime minister to have helped the British to defend themselves from the Japanese. So I think that's why Cecil was very concerned about the American people not understanding the war better than they did, because he saw that in Europe and in the Far East, and he felt that if Americans did not better understand what the war was about, and they were very passionate about contributing to the war effort, that it could not be a success. And one of the ways that he was wrong, and I guess we should say thankfully, is that during the war at various points he actually said that the Germans probably would not be defeated until 1948 and the Japanese probably until 49. So he missed that by a couple years.
Thankfully.
Yeah, thankfully, that's right. Yes, sir.
What distinguished him from the rest of the Murrow team, and why did he specifically get this moniker, Crusader for the Truth?
Because of the length of his career and his ability to have a very public forum, it was actually a bit of a blessing that he left CBS, because Mutual Radio, although it was not nearly as powerful, it was sort of the poor cousin of the other major networks. And during World War II, there was only NBC, but there were two NBC networks, and then there was CBS and Mutual. ABC did not yet exist, and of course PBS did not exist until about 1970. So Mutual was most well known for launching the dramatic series The Lone Ranger, which became highly successful, of course. But of all the networks, it was the most liberal in terms of its breadth of opinion and opinion commentators that they allowed to have voice on Mutual. And so, I mean, they had far right conservatives like Fulton Lewis, and then obviously to the other end of the spectrum like Cecil and a few others. So being that situation, he was allowed to have his voice dating into the late 1950s. And then because television was just sort of figuring out, a lot of the things that he was able to do was because radio and then television was really just being created, and there really was not an understanding of what broadcast journalism was yet and what its capabilities could be. So they were making it up as they went along, and that's one of the reasons that Murrow is such an esteemed man, because he set the standard for the way to do things. And as I said, it cost him trouble and difficulties, but he maintained his voice in a liberal sense pretty much throughout his career. And I think it's probably understanding his personality and the kinds of jobs that he had and where he went in his career. I think he probably would have left the journalism profession if he had not been allowed to have that voice, because he was pretty strong-headed about being able to speak.
Oh, I have a question. I didn't see any other hands. Did I interrupt anybody? Okay. So, first, I think I just wanted to clarify something for the audience in case you're wondering. So the Repulse and the Prince of Wales, or what the Prince of Wales was a battleship, one of the biggest British battleships. The Repulse was a big British battle cruiser, and they'd both been instrumental in the hunt for the Bismarck. So they had successfully hunted down and destroyed this huge German battleship. So they were not just two random ships; they were two, most prestigious ships in the British Navy, and they just got sunk with, like that, without having any impact in the Pacific theater. We were discussing this a bit last night. The idea that, and one thing that I found so interesting in the book that I didn't know about in terms of the background is, I think because of, movies and just historical, casting of a golden age, we tend to think of World War II as this moral war where everybody realized the Nazis were the bad guys and we had to go and fight them and save the world and stuff. But one of the things that comes out in one of the things I think that frustrated Cecil so much was that people didn't really understand why World War II was happening, and they didn't really care about it. If they were living in, it's important to remember, American civilians weren't killed. America wasn't, civilian populations weren't bombed, right? And even military involvement was pretty limited compared to other countries. So, I mean, that was something that was really surprising to me, because I think we tend to think of this as a time of clarity, but I think he was encountering a lot of lack of knowledge, lack of awareness, and that was something that really frustrated him. Would you say that's correct, or is...
Absolutely. I think mainstream history has generally sold World War II as, of course, the good war, and a war in which the vast majority of Americans supported it and were all in, and therefore understood the morality of being involved in it. But as he and a number of other authors have found, as I was doing my research, there's some other scholarly books out there that talk about there being a fairly healthy minority that either didn't understand the war or didn't support it. Didn't think it was worth dying for, didn't think it was worth capital investment and those kinds of things. So yeah, but of course, the War Department here in Washington recruited the national networks, the radio networks, and basically made them spokespersons for the U.S. government. They were totally on board in terms of patriotism.
He never had any, when he was stationed in Japan after the war, he never sort of said, boy, I can't believe these are the same people who sunk that ship I was on, or anything like that. He never had any, he didn't seem to, in his book, we talked about this a bit, he has a negative perception of Germans. That's pretty clear. He blames the entire German nation for he doesn't just say, there's the Nazis are fooling everybody. But he didn't ever come across any kind of assessments of the Japanese nation or Japanese character or something like that in his.
No, he didn't seem to. You're right that he had a great dislike for the German people, because of his experiences apparently in Europe, but he also had experienced the Japanese to a degree and understood their war tactics, but he seemed to have more respect for them, and I'm not totally certain why that was the case. I don't have a good answer for that.
Probably made for some good cocktail conversation when he was in Tokyo. Yeah. He's like, I remember when you guys sunk me on the ship.
Could his dislike of the Germans also come from the fact that he was, after all, a secular Jew? The Germans prefer Holocaust.
True. But we talked about this last time.
One of the interesting things about the book, I remember when I first read or looked through his Suez Singapore book, which was published in 1942. So
He didn't know about it.
Exactly. So first of all, I don't think he knew about any of that yet. But when he's writing this about the Germans. But what's also really interesting is I was wondering, why is he writing this book after Pearl Harbor? I mean, the U.S. is already in the war. And it only made sense when you think about he's going around a country that he feels is actually not particularly interested in this war. And so he's writing this book and it comes up throughout the book. I mean, he's really saying we have to fight this war. This is a war against slavery, for freedom. It's a war against evil. It's almost like Manichaean terms. And it makes sense when you realize that this is not at all a country whose population has made a decision and a commitment about this conflict. Sorry to talk in your speech.
No.
Kate, yes.
How do you think Cecil would use his voice today in response to the administration's treatment of the press and also stance on immigration?
Oh, he would be astounded by the current administration approach. If he were commentating, the only venue I can imagine here that he would be allowed to make the kind of comments that he did would be PBS. He sort of reminds me of a latter-day Bill Moyers. For those of you who are familiar with the work that he used to do on PBS a few years ago, You know, similar in that vein. You know, I think his worldview was similar, and I think his work was similarly hard hitting. And he had this real sense of morality, so he would have been highly offended, I believe, at the treatment of immigrants by the administration. And certainly the labeling of fake news, you know, whereas a lot of people, he had retired from journalism when Watergate took place in the early 70s, but he was still speaking, and in some of his speeches that he gave around California, whereas Woodward and Bernstein and, you know, others were being saluted, he was saying the press did a lousy job of reporting Watergate. You know, they were very late to the game, and they needed to be much more hard-hitting in talking about how journalism had really needed to have reported on what the Nixon administration was doing long before the break-in took place. I hope that answers your question.
Any last question or comment?
Happy Valentine's Day.
Yeah,
Happy Valentine's Day to everyone.
Well, thank you very much, Schmidt.